Hello, good morning. Welcome to this week's Learn with Lorna, episode number 213, where we're marking Seachdain na Gaidhlig International World Gaelic Week. My name is Lorna McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 centres in the Highlands of Scotland, in Inverness, Fort William, Portree and Wick, where we look after historic documents relating to this part of the world. This series is brought to you by Highlife Highland at no cost to the viewer. Highlife Highland's a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we're very grateful for that, and thank you to those of you who have done so. It really does make a difference to us. So as I say, welcome to this episode where we're looking at Gaelic in our collections as part of Seachdain na Gaidhlig 2025 World Gaelic Week. World Gaelic Week was established in 2022, funded by the Board na Gaelic, and has the aim of celebrating Scottish Gaelic across the globe and raising the profile of Gaelic, both language and culture, through a whole range of projects, events and programmes. And this year's Seachdain na Gaidhlig takes place from the 24th of February to the 2nd of March, so we are right in the middle of it now. This year's theme is Building Connections, celebrating the ways that sharing this unique language helps us to build connections linguistically, culturally and socially. And while we inhabit a part of the world that is so central to Gaelic culture, we hold collections that relate to those communities, but we hold relatively few documents across our centres that are specifically in the Gaelic language or with a specific focus on Gaelic. These are archival gaps that exist for a variety of reasons. However, we do hold some treasures. So let's start in Seachdain Archive Centre, the area most strongly associated of all our offices with Gaelic language. Last year we were absolutely delighted to be gifted 2 collections particularly relevant to this week's subject. One was the poetry of Donald Alec MacDonald, and I'm going to paraphrase here from Topper and Dochus to give some context about this collection and this man in particular. Donald Alex was born in 1914 in Manish and Harris. He was one of 12 children born to William MacDonald and Marion MacLeod. He was 12 when his family left Harris for Skye, where he would continue his education and also take on learning the pipes, something which he continued to do. After serving with the Royal Navy in World War II, Donald settled in Govan, where he started seeing Rachel Ross, a Skye girl who was working in Glasgow. The two went out together for a time, but eventually went their separate ways, Rachel marrying Murdo John McQueen and returning to Skye, and Donald Alex marrying and going on to run a hotel in Ayrshire. But the time with Rachel had left a mark and was important to him, because it was the inspiration behind his writing the words of Gaidhlig, remembering you. Now this has become a song that is very well known, loved by many people and recorded by some particularly high-profile Gaelic singers. But it wasn't until relatively recently that the writer and the inspiration behind this song became known. So we're absolutely delighted that a notebook containing 20 of Donald Alex's poems was deposited with us at Seachdain Archive Centre last year, a very welcome addition to our collections with a focus particularly on the Gaelic language. Another collection that we've recently taken in Seachdain comprises glassplate negatives, Gaelic poems and notebooks by the Reverend Donald McCallum, who was a Church of Scotland minister from Argyll. Donald was born in 1849, a crofter's son from Craignish in Kilmartin. He was a radical minister and was involved in the crofters' cause in Skye, in Tiree and in Lewis. He was heavily involved in the Highland Land League and was a prolific writer of prose, songs and poetry, some of which made his opinions on individuals absolutely beyond any doubt. McCallum continued to stand up for the rights of the crofters as he continued his work in the ministry, and he ended his career in the parish of Lochs in Lewis in 1920, before returning to Glendale, where he lived until his death in 1929. And this collection, which contains Gaelic poems, writings and images, is in the process of being catalogued and made accessible. So great to have had these 2 collections come in recent months. I've mentioned before the Donald Gillis collection held in Seachdain Archives. This is Catherine's overview of Donald Gillis. We hold a series of Gaelic works by Donald, born at 3 Painmore Scabost Bridge on the 18th of February 1881, although his Gillis family were originally from the Isle of Raasay, where samples of his grandfather's work as a stonemason can still be seen around Raasay House. The Gillis family had been among 198 people cleared from Raasay in 1852 to make way for a deer forest. When he was 18, Donald was employed as a servant of the manse, working for Mr. Lamont, minister of the Free Church at Snizort. And in 1969, Donald would publish the life and work of the very Reverend Roderick MacLeod of Snizort, predecessor to Mr. Lamont. Amongst our collection, as well as a copy of the manuscript, we have Donald's notes on the ecclesiastical history of Skye and some notes on Duke Street Gaelic Church in Glasgow and its ministers. Donald Gillis moved to Glasgow in 1900, finding work from the River Clyde Navigation Trust. In 1910, he married Catherine Robertson, originally from Waterloo in the Isle of Skye, and together in Glasgow they raised their family of 5 daughters and 1 son. Donald, a fluent Gaelic speaker, composed many pieces of literature, poems, songs, plays and short stories, which won him a number of prizes at the National Mod over the years, culminating with him winning the Bardic Crown at the National Mod in 1932, as well as literary prizes at the Festival of Britain in 1951. So a range of material there that has come into us both recently and over the years, relating particularly to poetry, songs, and you'll see that everything I've referred to so far includes that kind of creative expression of feelings, that way of using language and culture as a way of talking about loss, of fear, of anger, of love. Many of those have been written in response to land disputes, but also many written in response to war and conflict. And we hold various Gaelic poems written about the impact, personal, local and national, of World War I. I'm going to share a couple with you in English because, as you are aware, if you've been following me for the last 200 episodes, I don't speak Gaelic. I'm going to share them with you in English and share the Gaelic wordings in a post later on today. These verses were written by Neil Gow Beaton, who was born in Valtos, about his time in the Navy in World War I. We received an urgent order on Saturday before the Sabbath to go down by the English lands, and I wouldn't promise it would be safe. My heart is heavy, so sad am I. It's in the Isle of Skye that I would wish to be just now. It is there I would be secure, without fear before an enemy. My heart is heavy, so sad am I. This lament, a subsequent one, was written by another Valtos man, written to remember local men who fell during that conflict. Douglas is lying in a foreign land, overcome by the heat of the sun. Delightful was he in company with no concerns around him. Jonathan MacLeod and Donald, son of Jonathan, in the first flush of youth amongst the hardship, and though we expected them to survive, it was news of their death that we received. Their graves are not in the cemetery in the land of their dwelling, and we will mourn them across the district all the days of our lives there. John Cade MacLean, who'll be a name known to many of you, I'm sure, from Portree, served in World War I as a telegraphist with the Royal Engineers. He was one of the founders of the Glasgow Skye Shinty team and was the referee for the 1924 international between Scotland and Ireland. A flamboyant and colourful character, he often expressed himself through poetry, including this particularly beautiful little verse. Each night and day in my thoughts, if we, my dear, be spared, to Glendale we will go, to a little white bothy, where nothing but the roar of the sea will reach us. Gaelic in the arts is something that we see a lot in our collections. And we can also see it in the collection of the MacDonald sisters. I've done a previous Learn with Lorna on that fantastic collection, these 2 sisters and all their creative endeavours. So if you haven't watched that one yet, do go and check that out. But despite their international childhoods, they spent time in South Africa and in India. Myra and Katrina MacDonald always maintained a close connection to Skye, which was the home of their parents and of multiple other relatives, and their work is absolutely infused with Gaelic language and culture. In one of her illustrations, Myra included 2 Highland cows looking at a busload of tourists and asking them, "Who let you out?" And that humour about both the reality in the Highlands and the humour that kind of overlays that is similar to the perspectives and the satirical content that we find within the Angus Og collection, a very well-loved collection again held at Skye and Lochash. Here are my colleague Catherine's thoughts on the Gaelic, the peculiarly Gaelic nature of Ewan Bain's Angus Og cartoon strips. Ewan Bain was raised in a Gaelic-speaking household. He was a fluent speaker of the language and had a deep knowledge and understanding of Gaelic history and culture. Gaelic flows through the adventures of Angus Og, although as the stories appeared in an English language newspaper, they speak primarily in English. However, Bain had a great ear for dialects and represented the Hebridean English of the Western Isles through the use of I dialect, e.g. just instead of just, every instead of every, and occasionally in a sentence structure that suggests an English translated from the Gaelic. You're left with the feeling that if you were not in the room, Angus and his friends would be speaking Gaelic. And indeed at this time it was considered rude to speak Gaelic in front of those who did not have it, and so this just reflects what may well have happened if Angus's readers had met a company of real-life Gaelic speakers in the 1960s. Ewan Bain reflected many contemporary Gaels' experiences and frustrations as a product of an education system designed to discourage the use of the language. On being asked why he himself, fluent in Gaelic, didn't produce a Gaelic cartoon strip, he stated that he was one of those illiterate Gaels referred to by Johnson in his 1775 journey to the Western Isles. Bain describes himself as an illiterate Gael, unable to spell in Gaelic. Frustrating indeed to be so proficient in the written word and unable to communicate that medium through your own language. There appears throughout a sense of confidence and pride in the language, in Gaelic words and phrases that appear regularly through the strips. In doing this, Ewan Bain brought the language to a whole new audience. During Bain's lifetime, perceptions of the Gaelic language shifted. Language activists explored new ways to raise the profile of the language and to encourage young people to use and learn Gaelic even as the number of speakers declined. A growing awareness of the potential loss of culture and identity along with the language and its association with an emerging Scottish national identity only enhanced efforts, which included the introduction of Gaelic media, road signs and language learning programmes, and the opening of the Gaelic College Salmarostig. These developments are all reflected in Ewan Bain's cartoons. While he may not have described himself as a Gaelic activist, he was informed about the position of the language in Scotland. He quotes accurately the number of Gaelic speakers in Scotland from census figures of 1961 and appeared in one of the first Gaelic TV programmes for children. His use of Gaelic words, phrases and ideology throughout the Angus Og adventures arguably brought the Gaelic language in a fun and affectionate way into the households of many who had rarely, if ever, encountered it before, and demonstrated its vitalness to the cultural identity of the Highlands, the Islands and the Gaelic diaspora. So some really interesting thoughts there around the way that that language can be used within a humorous setting, within a light-hearted and fun setting, out with the Gaelic-speaking diaspora to share some thoughts, some comments, some ideologies. Now, in that extract there, Catherine referenced Gaelic in the education system, either being repressed or being used as the medium of education. And I wanted to share a few interesting examples of Gaelic within the education records. The first is a really lovely little entry I came across a few weeks ago when I was preparing for a visit from the pupils of Dugarach Primary, who were coming in as part of their 150th anniversary celebrations. And this is from the opening pages of that school logbook. So Dugarach School, October 1875. The attendance was very irregular, owing principally to potato lifting and to so many of the children being without shoes. 5 new pupils were admitted. 2 of them, not able to understand a single word of English, were very shy and actually trembling with fear. But on finding out that the master could speak to them in Gaelic about their dog, hens, cat, mother, baby, etc., they did wonderfully cheer up and began their difficult tasks. I found that quite a moving entry because the 1872 Education Act made no provision for Gaelic language education, with lessons being delivered in English. And the low status that was afforded to the language and the perceived disadvantages of speaking Gaelic led many parents to encourage the English speaking over Gaelic, leading gradually to language shift and loss, which takes a huge amount to come back from. It wasn't until 100 years later, in the 1980s, that the Gaelic medium education was officially introduced back into selected schools. So that entry is written at a time when pupils were being encouraged to speak English over Gaelic, but the kindness of that teacher in using those new pupils' mother tongue to put them at ease shows the way that familiarity and the recognition of your identity can bring comfort to you. I found one teacher in our school admission files who took this even further, not just using it on the first day to put people at their ease, but using something already familiar, their mother tongue, to teach. And this was a really fascinating set of records that I came across. In 1930, Sheriff McMaster Campbell, who was the president of Uncommon Gaidhlig, the Highland Society, wrote to Mr Morrison of the Inverness Council Education Authority, Inverness County Education Authority. We've spoken a lot about Mr Morrison over the last few weeks, but Sheriff McMaster Campbell wrote to Mr Morrison, and this is what he asked for. Dear Mr Morrison, I propose directing my presidential address, so President of Uncommon, at Dunoon to the teaching of Gaelic in relation to certain recent experiments of a psychological character bearing on bilingualism. I wonder if I might bespeak your assistance. What I would like to get first is a copy of the Education Code so far as it relates to the teaching of Gaelic. Then I would feel obliged if you could tell me what the method of teaching monoglot children is whose home tongue is Gaelic. Are they taught in English as soon as they enter school? Similarly, I would like to know how the child is taught to begin with, whose only language is English, but who is to be taught Gaelic in school. Are they taught concurrently? You will know the points I'm driving at, and possibly to the expert, my meditations may appear as those of a sorry amateur, but I rather think that something may be accomplished by the ventilation of this subject. I am fortunate in the possession of the full text of Sir Percy Watkins' recent address to the Pan-Celtic Congress, and my thesis will look to apply his views to our Gaelic situation. Incidentally, I am to plead strongly for the reinforcement of our Scottish Education Department by an officer corresponding in relation to the Highlands to Sir Percy Watkins in relation to Wales. Thanking you in anticipation. So as he's putting together his talk as the president of Uncommon, he is referring to Sir Percy Watkins' text. Now, Sir Percy Watkins had a role in Wales that was around bilingual education and that immersion in the Welsh language, which we still see today. And so he was writing to Mr Morrison to see if there was anything comparable happening in Highland. And Mr Morrison's response was to write to Mr Stone, the head teacher at Castlebay Primary in Barra, asking for details of experimental work that had been undertaken by Miss McNeill, who was the infant mistress a few years previously, infant mistress in North Bay Primary School. She gave her entire first year's education in the Gaelic language. And we hold her response, and it's very detailed and it's absolutely fascinating. And I'll post later on today or I will post at some point this week, some extracts from this very detailed response. But it starts with this summary of the first stage of education as taught by her in a Gaelic medium. She says, at this stage, information already possessed by the children was made use of by the teacher in bringing the child out of himself, as it were. Speech was encouraged in every way possible. Gaelic nursery rhymes and number games, conversation about common objects at home, school furniture, fairy tales, impromptu nature study lessons on birds, animals, plants, fishes, and mentioned in fairy tales, stories, riddles, lullabies and songs, observation lessons, etc. Things like what the child saw on the way to and from school, all were used in education. So she starts with that opening of, very much like that Dochgarach primary entry, start with what you know, make the children feel at ease in talking about things that they can already talk about in their native tongue. Children were then encouraged to write and draw the Gaelic words of 2 or 3 letters on slates or on linoleum and to etch them out. This is an extract from stage 2, where she says, with the exception of reading, all of Gaelic instruction was given in the form of a céilí. To get the colour and atmosphere of a real céilí, the older children got up a few dramatic sketches, one of which was always enacted by all the boys before starting the céilí. And stories and other elements of Gaelic culture and folklore are interwoven through everything she tried to do in that Gaelic medium education, in writing, in reading, performance, music, nature study, games. Everything is connecting to Fionn, to the Fingalians, to elements of Gaelic heritage and folklore. There's a focus on Gaelic idiom and on beautiful words, phrases, and morals within those tales. What can they tell the children today about, or in 1930 rather, about life? Moving from the second to the third stage involved learning the Gaelic names for wildflowers, habitats, medicinal and dyeing properties of plants, as well as learning which plants could be used as charms against the fairies. A focus on birds and animals and their roles within Gaelic culture and where they appear within stories and fairy tales. And then this was all followed up in the classroom by sessions designed to correct pronunciation, to explain word endings and grammar once they had become interested in the stories through the medium of story. She says the blackboard was much used in explaining things. And geography and history were taught very much like this as well, and taught from a local perspective, starting with what the pupils already knew. So for instance, they started with their geography lessons by looking at the place names of Barra. Where had those place names come from? Which languages had they evolved from? And then broadening that out into bigger subjects like the story of the Celts, the lordship of the Isles, early Christianity, the clanship and feudal systems. So it's starting with that very, very local perspective through the medium of Gaelic and then building that out and out from beyond from Barra. Now, as you might expect, the use of song and poetry as a way to teach is really clear in this document. So, for instance, she explains that the children are taught labour songs, walking songs, very suitable for the teaching of history, manners and customs of bygone days. She mentions rowing songs, milking songs, churning songs, riding songs, and sea songs, all serving a different purpose in teaching about the language and culture, and also then using that to learn about grammar, language structure, and so on. There was a real focus in her teaching as well on respect, on kindness, and on what could be learnt from others. So within her curriculum planning, boys had to assist their fathers in building and thatching outbuildings and learning the traditional names of tools and parts of the buildings. Girls were to assist and learn from their mothers, and it was very clearly stated that all children, all pupils, are to spend time with their grandparents and learn from them as they're a type dying out. And I wanted to finish this section to do with this particular teacher with this extract about seasonal lessons and games, because it's a really beautiful little entry. She says, at the new year, things were revised, some things were revised and new things were learned. Parents and grandparents were willing helpers in this. To obtain the cooperation of parents, etc., and to awaken their interest in the Gaelic movement and instruction of Gaelic in their children, history, music, manners and customs of the olden times, the old custom of walking and working with the blankets was revived and was made a public affair. All were cordially invited, men, women, young and old. Old women came from all the villages to take part in the walking. In the walking over, they enjoyed a spirited reel to the tune of the bagpipes. They danced gracefully and were a lesson in deportment and manners to the younger generation, and many old songs were unearthed. And this particular teacher finishes her report by saying that this was a very experimental method, immersed in nature and culture and fairy tale and the Gaelic language. But she says, I found that this method, the method given here, produced good results, and pupils ended up with an extensive vocabulary in Gaelic. It was also really interesting to me to note there that she had found this was a benefit in gaining the buy-in from parents and grandparents about the importance of the Gaelic movement and the importance of maintaining the language and continuing the customs. Quite surprising on the west, in the Western Isles, where you would think that would be already ingrained. Perhaps the aim was to result in fostering the sort of feeling that we see referred to here in this letter written by Simon Fraser in May 1740, when he says to his father, Lord Lovat, not to worry about him losing the Gaelic. He says, whoever's told you that I'm not practicing my Gaelic is not telling the truth. There is not a day goes by but we speak it at dinner, supper and breakfast. I know your lordship would rather me lose Latin and Greek than lose the Gaelic. And that is the great reason for carrying on. He goes on to say that although he thinks now that no matter where he went in the world, he would never lose the Gaelic. And he says he picks up the Edinburgh tone when he's there, and the Glasgow tone when he's there, and when he comes north again, he picks up the Highland tone with his Gaelic. But whatever the point is, to reassure his father that he has no intention of not using it. And that connection to Gaelic, to the language and to the Gaelic culture remains absolutely vital to many thousands of people across the Highlands and Islands and across the Highland diaspora across the world. And we have now Gaelic medium schools, societies and groups, as well as, of course, many homes where Gaelic is the first language. All of our offices hold some material relating to the Gaelic language, and even if it's not in the Gaelic language, then it will be connected to the culture of the Gaels. Even Nucleus, covering Caithness, probably the area of Highlands and Islands least associated with Gaelic, holds the records of an Common Gaelic Wick branch, which was formed in 1925 with the aim of reviving and fostering interest in the language, literature and traditions of the Highlands. And the constitution of that branch reiterates the aims held by Uncommon since it was founded in 1891 and still echoed in their aims today: to encourage the teaching and use of the Gaelic language, the study and cultivation of Gaelic literature, history, music and art, they encourage and promote native industries of the Highlands. Uncommon's current aims now include the recognition of Gaelic as a living language and as a national asset by official bodies and organisations through a process of cooperation with others with the same aim. So hopefully you can see from that although we don't have a vast amount of written material in Gaelic, what we do have is absolutely fascinating and is very valuable to us and reflects various aspects of Gaelic language, culture, and the importance of folklore and stories and music, and the way that the language has been used to express feeling over the generations. So I hope you've enjoyed this episode and maybe learned something new from it. Hope you can join me next week. Next week I will be looking at the history of Inverness Museum and Art Gallery as part of their 200th celebrations. So a reminder that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we really appreciate that. Thank you.